Dr. Paul Roberts, we are thrilled to have you with us today on this program, and we're glad you took time to be with us here today.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Paul, I want to get right into this. We're going to talk about the Ukraine. You have, I've followed much of what you have been saying for a long time. Some cases, you're the first one out there on some issues. In some cases, controversial type positions. But if I could sum up what I think you have been saying, I want to say that and then ask you, are these statements still correct? Basically, you've said that it's a no-win scenario for the U.S. in the Ukraine. I think you've referred to stupid foreign policy, pretty much a direct quote, being pursued by the Obama administration. If the truth were known, the Ukrainian government was actually, in effect, a $5 billion facilitated coup by the Obama administration and wanted pro-Western moderates, but instead some radical neo-Nazis have kind of moved in. And you've stated very recently that, quote, the greatest threat the world has ever known, end quote, is there in the Ukraine. You made that statement several days ago. I want to ask you, do you still see the situation in the Ukraine as that high a level of concern?
Well, it was a reckless act on the part of the Obama regime to seize power in Ukraine and stick it into the European Union. And the reason they want it there is partially so it can be looted economically, but mainly they want, if you join the EU, you end up in NATO. And so they want the Ukraine in NATO so that Washington can put anti-ballistic missile bases on Russia's border with the Ukraine. And the purpose of that is to degrade Russia's strategic deterrent so that Russia can't really stand up to American hegemony. You know, the neoconservatives who have been very strong in the government in Washington since the Clinton years have this ideology of American world hegemony, and the obstacles to that are Russia, China, and Iran. And so they're all targeted for intimidation by being surrounded with military bases so that they don't oppose Washington's will. And when you take a direct strategic threat like this to a nuclear-armed country such as Russia, it's a very reckless act. And the Russians really can't tolerate something like that because it basically would mean they've given up and accepted American dominance. And these are people, you have to remember, they defeated Napoleon, they defeated Hitler, and they're not inclined to be bossed around by a bunch of people in Washington.
All right, so you're not backing off of what you're saying, and if I could, you speak to both economics and foreign policy. And I want to ask you a question that I have not seen asked of anyone, even in the interviews that have been done with you. But to me, when it was made, I thought it was significant, and it's this. Last week, Sergei Glazyev, a prominent economic advisor to Vladimir Putin, said this, quote, Russia could reduce its economic dependency on the United States to zero if the U.S. imposed sanctions on Moscow. And he warned that the American financial system, he said, faced a crash. He went on to then say, and then he said this, quote, Russia could stop using dollars for international transactions and create its own payment system using its wonderful relations with our partners in the East and the South, end quote. He went on to say that Russian banks would not return loans and the American domination of the global financial system would end. Now, knowing that Russia, Paul Roberts, that Russia's been working on accomplishing this with the BRICS nation, Russia, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they've been talking about that. Is this threat to be taken seriously, or is an idle threat? Because I haven't heard much about it.
Well, it's a response of Russia to the threats that Obama and Kerry have made about putting sanctions on Russia like they did on Iran. And so it's certainly a realistic threat. In fact, you've already said, Sam, that it's something that the BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, already have in a planning stage. They're already developing this because they're tired of American financial imperialism. The United States has abused the world currency role and used the dollar as a weapon, a financial weapon against other countries. And it was a mistake. When I was in the Treasury, we never would have permitted anything like this. But we did not have at that time these neoconservatives with their ideology of America ruling the world. But when you abuse the role that you are trusted with as world currency and use it as a weapon, then you have to expect other countries to take defensive measures. And they are already taking those measures. And I think that that's what the Russian is reminding John Kerry and Obama of. Look, this cuts both ways. And we're not Iraq. We're not Iran. Our partners, you see the BRICS, there are 5 countries. They account for half of the population in the world, includes China. So the people in Washington are really sticking their fingers in the eyes of many big, powerful countries. And it's stupid. I mean, there's no point to it. Why should the United States have hegemony over the world? Now, when you ask the neoconservatives, they say, oh, that's because we are the exceptional people. We are indispensable. That sounds like Adolf Hitler. That's what he said about the Germans. And so you've got the same kind of ideology, and it's ingrained in Washington, in the government. It's dangerous. People need to be aware of that. It's a very dangerous thing, and it takes great risk. If you have an ideology that says you are special, you're above everybody else, then you do reckless things. And that's what the United States is doing under the influence of this ideology. Ronald Reagan wouldn't have tolerated this for a second. He had no intention of taking this kind of position in the world. And yet that's what the United States is doing now. And sometimes they claim to be Reagan people, but they're clearly not. They've come from somewhere else. It's some new, very dangerous political ideology. And I think that it's alarmed nuclear powers. There's no point in doing that. These weapons, if they are unleashed, it's the end. And so it is dangerous.
Clearly that is. Paul, I'm going to step in here. A co-host today is Daria Novak. Now, she's actually physically sitting up there in Connecticut right now. She was a former employee of the State Department, I think, back during that time. And I know she has a question here. Daria, you want to get in here on this discussion?
Yeah, I'm getting to be pretty old. I was in the Reagan administration, too. Well, I was actually looking at it from the point of view of domestic economy in the Ukraine. There's a newly appointed economy minister, Pavlo Sheremetyev. I may be mispronouncing his name a little. Now, when he's been interviewed, he says that if the Ukraine is to survive and survive well, they have to fix the economy, fix it fast. Now, they're known for corruption, systemic inefficiency, subsidies, energy dependence, all kinds of problems. Now, he wants to sign a partnership with the EU. He wants companies in the Ukraine to adopt European Union standards. He wants to relaunch the economy, normalize trade with Russia, all of this, get them out of the medieval procedures of paper and move them into e-commerce. Do you think the way things stand today that the Ukraine can do that and that then they would be able to stand up to Russia?
Well, look, the Ukraine economy is integrated into the Russian economy. And it's not integrated into the EU. And so what does this transformation mean? What it really means is an IMF austerity program will be imposed on Ukraine so that Ukraine can pay back the Western bankers. So what will happen? Government pensions will be cut. People will be laid off. The American agricultural corporations will get their hands on Ukrainian farmland. The banks, the Western banks will loot the country like they did Greece, Cyprus, and they will, and the Western corporations will simply simply take over whatever is functional in Ukraine. So what it really means is Ukraine will be looted, and the people that Washington has stuck into this coup government are content with that because they will be paid off. So it's really, for them, it was just a fight over who gets the money for corruption. So they said, well, we've moved the old guys away, now we're going to get it. And that's all it is. So I don't think there's any prospects for Ukraine. Already, the southern part has voted to leave the country, and the eastern part is in the process. They have the same kinds of protests against the coup government in Kiev. You have to remember, the eastern and southern parts of present-day Ukraine were created by Khrushchev in 1950 when he took Russian provinces and stuck them into the Ukraine. So Ukraine today is really two different countries, and the eastern and southern parts were always Russian territories, and the people there are Russian, they speak Russian. And they don't want anything to do with what we have done in Kiev. So the country is going to be split in two. And the western part is the least capable, and they'll simply lose their farmlands to American agribusiness. So that's going to be the outcome. If the people in Washington push this too hard and they make this strategic threat too unbearable for the Russians, then we risk a real serious confrontation.
Okay, Paul, I'm sorry to cut in on you. You had made, I think, a comment at some point that again, we're talking about it right here. That really, protesters on the ground, there was a U.S. financing of it. I have a contact, friend of mine, who's actually sitting in Kiev right now, and he sent me an email not too long ago, where he said that on the ground, that the protesters there in Kiev and over in Donetsk, if that's the way you pronounce that, are Russian-financed, nothing over here, and that there, the folks, the good, true freedom-loving folks, they fear Russia and Putin. They don't fear the U.S. and the EU. Is that compatible with what?
Well, I don't know what he's talking about. He doesn't sound very well informed to me. It's all over the European news. Everyone knows that protesters were paid to protest in Kiev. They were paid
by the Russians or by the United States?
By the American financed NGOs and by that German institute, the Konrad Adenauer. People have reported over and over. They were busing people in from Moldova. So this is not even debatable. Washington thought it was going to stick in some moderate stooges that it had been cultivating. Victoria Nuland said, we spent $5 billion cultivating these people, and now we're going to put them in office. And the trouble is, they apparently overlooked these extreme right-wing elements that introduced violence into the protest and changed the demands. If you remember, the initial demands was to take Ukraine into the EU. And all of a sudden, it became to overthrow the government, and now you've got these right-wing elements actually intimidating the American-selected government. So it's a very serious situation now for the Americans because they've kind of lost control of this coup that they orchestrated. And how they're going to put down these ultra-nationalists who actually armed is not clear. We don't know. I don't know how this is going to work out. The American media is just simply following whatever Washington says and not reporting.
We're winding down here a little bit. I do want to ask you this. You made a comment, being a former Reagan appointee, about there are those, the neos and so forth, who hold to exceptionalism, and that they're really trying to drive it there. Reagan, obviously, he did talk about the exceptionalism of who and what we are. Balance what you're saying there, because Reagan was that. How would he have held to exceptionalism and done differently what's taking place right now?
Well, look, I was part of the Reagan thing even when I left the Treasury. Reagan had two goals. One was to cure the stagflation. That's what supply-side economics was about. And the other was to end the Cold War. And he said over and over, it's no intention of winning it. We don't want a conflict. We want to end it. And all the agreements that Reagan made with Gorbachev were immediately broken by his successors. You know, Reagan said, we'll never take NATO into Eastern Europe. Well, that's the first thing that George Bush did. We'll never leave the ABM treaty. That's the first thing that George W. Bush did. All we've done since is to break every agreement that Reagan made that ended the Cold War. So it has nothing to do with Reagan. Nothing. If he was around, he'd be screaming and yelling about it. Where do you see respect for law in Washington? They say that we can torture, we can arrest people and detain them indefinitely without warrants or without presenting evidence. And they even say now they can assassinate American citizens without due process of law. They can invade countries. You know, under the Nuremberg Standard, what we did in Afghanistan, Iraq, are war crimes. So it's nothing to do with Reagan. Reagan would never have behaved like this in any way.
And, Paul, we're going to have to go because we're right here at the top of the hour. I want you to give folks, our listeners, where to go to find out more about what you are saying and or writing, if you could do that, please.
Well, there's a website. It's just www.paulcraigroberts.org.
paulcraigroberts.org. Thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it, and I'll be looking forward to talking to you again
well,
later.
Sam,
thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing your audience.
All right, you're welcome.